Imagine a man who was born in a small, sleepy town in Scotland, a man who was a mediocre student, a man who had no formal scientific training, a man who was widely considered a failure by his peers. Now, imagine that this same man would go on to invent a device that would change the world. A device that would shrink the vast distances of the globe. A device that would connect humanity in ways that had never been possible before. This is the story of Alexander Graham Bell, a man whose name has become synonymous with the telephone. A man whose invention would spark a revolution in communication. And a man whose life was defined by a relentless curiosity, a deep compassion for the deaf, and a lifelong quest to understand the mysteries of sound. But here is what most people do not realize about Alexander Graham Bell. He did not invent the telephone to become rich or famous. He invented it because he was trying to help his deaf mother and his deaf wife communicate with the world. He was a man who was driven not by ambition, but by love. He was a man who spent his entire life trying to bridge the gap between the hearing and the deaf. A man who believed that the ability to communicate was the most fundamental human right. He was not just an inventor, he was a teacher, a humanitarian, and a man whose greatest legacy was not a device, but a profound belief in the power of connection. To understand Alexander Graham Bell, you have to go back to the beginning, to the foggy streets of Edinburgh, Scotland, where he was born on March 3, 1847, into a family that was steeped in the study of speech and sound. His grandfather, Alexander Bell, was a renowned elocutionist, a man who taught people how to speak clearly and effectively. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, was a pioneering phonetician, a man who had developed a system called visible speech, a method of representing the sounds of speech through a series of symbols. His mother, Eliza Grace Simmons, was a gifted musician and painter, a woman of immense intelligence and sensitivity, who was also deaf. It was his mother's deafness that would shape young Alexander's life and career. He grew up in a world of sound and silence, a world where he learned to communicate with his mother through a unique system of facial expressions and gestures. He was a boy who was deeply attuned to the nuances of human communication, a boy who understood the pain of isolation and the power of connection. He was a man who was determined to find a way to bridge the gap between the hearing and the deaf. Bell was a curious and inventive child, but he was not a particularly gifted student. He was a mediocre student at school, a fact that disappointed his father deeply. He was a boy who was more interested in tinkering with machines and conducting experiments than in studying Latin and Greek. He had a restless, inquisitive mind, a mind that was constantly seeking to understand how things worked. He was particularly fascinated by the mechanics of speech and hearing, a fascination that was fueled by his mother's deafness. He spent hours watching his father teach elocution, observing the intricate movements of the mouth and the throat, studying the physics of sound. He was a boy who was laying the foundations for his life's work. The turning point in his life came when he moved to London to join his brother, who was also working in the field of speech therapy. He became a teacher of the deaf, a profession that gave him immense satisfaction and a deep sense of purpose. He was a man who was able to connect with his students in a way that no one else could, a man who understood their struggles and their frustrations. He was a man who was not just teaching them to speak, he was teaching them to be heard, to be seen, to be understood. He was a man who was driven by a profound belief that every human being deserved the right to communicate. He was also a man who was constantly seeking to improve his methods. He began to experiment with a device that could transmit sound through electricity, a device that would ultimately become the telephone. He was a man who was trying to create a world where distance was no longer a barrier to human connection. In 1870, tragedy struck the Bell family. His older brother, Edward, died of tuberculosis, a devastating loss that left the family in a state of profound grief. His father decided to move the family to Canada, seeking a fresh start and a healthier climate. Bell was now a young man, a man who was determined to pursue his own path. He moved to Boston, where he became a teacher at the Boston School for Deaf Mutes, a position that gave him the financial stability and the intellectual freedom to continue his experiments. He was a man who was consumed by his work, a man who spent his days teaching and his nights in his laboratory, trying to unlock the secrets of sound transmission. He was a man who was driven by a vision of a world where the deaf could hear, a world where people could communicate across vast distances, a world where no one was alone. He was a man who was not afraid to dream, and he was a man who was not afraid to work. Bell's experiments were not without their challenges. He was working with limited resources, and he was often frustrated by the slow pace of his progress. He was a man who was constantly struggling against the limitations of his equipment and the skepticism of his peers. He was also struggling with his own health, battling bouts of exhaustion and depression. He was a man who was pushing himself to the limit, a man who was determined to succeed. He was a man who believed his invention could change the world. He was a man who was not willing to give up. He was a man who had found his calling, and he was determined to see it through. The moment of breakthrough came on March 10, 1876, a date that would forever be etched in the history of human communication. Bell was in his laboratory, working on a device that was designed to transmit sound through electricity. He was working with his assistant, Thomas Watson, who was in another room. Bell was speaking into the transmitter, trying to get the device to work. He called out to Watson, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." The words were barely audible, but Watson heard them clearly. It was the first successful transmission of intelligible speech over a wire. It was a moment of triumph, a moment that would change the course of history. He had done it. He had created the telephone. He was a man who had made the impossible possible. The invention was met with immense excitement, but it was also met with a storm of controversy. The telephone was a revolutionary device, but Bell was not the only person who had been working on it. He was engaged in a bitter legal battle with Elisha Gray, another inventor who had filed a similar patent on the same day. The case would drag on for years, a battle that would consume Bell's time and energy. He was a man who was forced to defend his invention against a constant barrage of legal challenges. He was a man who was caught in a battle for the very soul of his creation. He eventually won the legal battle, but the controversy would leave a lasting mark on his reputation. He was a man who was often accused of stealing the ideas of others. He was a man who was forced to fight for his legacy. The success of the telephone brought Bell immense fame and fortune. He became a celebrity, a man who was celebrated as the inventor of the most important device of the age. He was a man who was invited to the White House, a man who was honored by kings and queens, a man who was considered a hero. But fame and fortune did not bring him happiness. He was a man who was deeply uncomfortable with the spotlight, a man who was more interested in his work than in his public persona. He was a man who was constantly seeking new challenges, a man who was not satisfied with resting on his laurels. He turned his attention to other projects, including the development of the phonograph, the metal detector, and the photophone, a device that could transmit sound through light. He was a man who was never satisfied with the status quo, a man who was constantly striving to push the boundaries of human knowledge. But Bell's greatest passion remained his work with the deaf. He was a man who was deeply committed to helping the deaf community. He founded the Volta Bureau, an institution dedicated to the study of deafness and the promotion of communication among the deaf. He was a man who was not just an inventor, he was a teacher, a humanitarian, and a champion of the rights of the deaf. He was a man who was determined to create a world where deaf people could live full and productive lives. He was a man who believed that the ability to communicate was the most fundamental human right. He was a man who was driven by a deep and abiding love for his wife, Mabel Hubbard, who was deaf. He was a man who understood the pain of isolation and the power of connection. Bell's later years were marked by controversy and personal tragedy. He became increasingly involved in the eugenics movement, a deeply troubling aspect of his legacy. He was a man who believed that certain traits should be discouraged through selective breeding. It was a belief that was shared by many intellectuals of his time, but it is a belief that is now widely condemned. He was a man who was deeply flawed, a man who was not immune to the prejudices of his era. He was also a man who was deeply affected by the death of his wife, Mabel, in 1923. He died in 1922 at the age of 75. He was a man who had lived a life of immense achievement, a man who had changed the world, but he was also a man who had experienced profound loss and personal struggle. The legacy of Alexander Graham Bell is one of the most profound and enduring in human history. He is remembered as the inventor of the telephone, a device that has revolutionized the way we communicate. Its invention has connected the world in ways that were unimaginable in his time. It has shrunk the vast distances of the globe and has brought people closer together. It is a device that has become an essential part of modern life. He is a symbol of the power of human ingenuity, a man who dared to dream of a world where distance was no longer a barrier to connection. He is a man who is celebrated as one of the greatest inventors of all time. But there is a darker side to his legacy. His involvement in the eugenics movement is a stain on his reputation. He was a man who was not immune to the prejudices of his time. He was a man who believed that some people were inherently superior to others. He was a man who was deeply flawed. He was not just an inventor, he was a man who was shaped by the values of his era. It is a reminder that even the greatest minds can be blinded by the prejudices of their time. Why should someone born today still care about Alexander Graham Bell? Because his life is a testament to the power of curiosity and the importance of empathy. He was a man who was driven by a deep desire to help others, to bridge the gap between the hearing and the deaf. He was a man who believed that communication was the most fundamental human right, a man who was determined to make the world a more connected place. He was a man who was not afraid to fail, a man who was not afraid to experiment, a man who was not afraid to dream. He was a man who showed us that the greatest inventions are often born from a desire to help others, a man who showed us that the most powerful force in the world is the human desire to connect, to communicate, and to be understood. Bell once said, "Great discoveries and improvements invariably involve the cooperation of many minds. I may have been given credit for the telephone, but I was not the only one who was working on it." He was a man who was always humble, a man who was always willing to share credit. He was a man who believed that science was a collaborative endeavor, a man who believed that we are all part of a larger story. He was a man who was not afraid to be wrong, a man who was not afraid to learn from others. He was a man who was not afraid to change his mind. He was a man who was deeply flawed, a man who was shaped by the prejudices of his time, but he was also a man who was deeply committed to helping others. He was a man who gave us the gift of connection, a man who showed us that the human voice is the most powerful force in the world. He was a man who changed the world, and his story will continue to inspire generations to come. He is a reminder that the greatest achievements are often born from the deepest compassion, and that the most powerful force in the world is the human desire to connect, to communicate, and to be understood.